Now, can I welcome Sivakami Manoharan? Is it Manoharan? Sorry. I need to brush up on my Tamil. Now, I want to just say to you that she is an activist within the Tamil Youth Organization, and the aim of this organization is really, I think you work as a doctor in London, do you?
I do, yes.
Yeah, so she's a doctor as well, in London, and she's been obviously fighting the rights for Tamils, and the TYO is to, basic argument here is to empower and unite Tamil youth across the UK. A very important issue in the community is to unite people, into a mass movement of some sort, or whatever it is that you can do, and to advocate the rights of the Tamil nation in the northeast of the island as well, and also that. A lot of these organizations and communities, they want a peaceful solution and conflict resolution, and a fair solution in Sri Lanka, and they also fight for that. So welcome, can you address the conference, please?
Hello everyone. As Sally said, my name is Sivakami and I'm from the Tamil Youth Organisation. Can everyone hear me okay? So this second section is about resistance strategies, and I'm very much going to tackle it from a perspective as an activist, from an activist organisation, and also as a member of the Tamil nation here in England, as a diaspora, if you will. Before I do that, I'm just going to briefly touch on something that Jan has raised and a previous speaker raised as well, and it's very much the framework in which we're operating. So I think the framework is really key, as Jan said, to understanding how the events of 2009 were allowed to happen. The struggle has always been about genocide, but obviously after 9/11, the Sri Lankan government was very much able to frame it within this war on terror brand, as it were. So history and what actually happened was completely forgotten. The problem in Sri Lanka was then redefined as the LTTE. The problem was terrorism. If we get rid of terrorism, then that's fine, everything's going to be okay. Of course, now we know 3 years on that's very, very far from the truth, and we stand vindicated. But nonetheless, the fact that the problem was allowed to become the LTTE is why the world stood by. And as Jan said, the world, I absolutely agree with you, I think the world fundamentally knew what was going on. We know that now, they had the satellite footage, and yet, at the time, they turned a blind eye to it. And it's not just the governments. The fact that the LTT was prescribed, and therefore the Tamil nation was then criminalised, helped all of this. It meant that, for example, when our doctors were on the ground saying that the casualty numbers that the government is saying just do not reflect what's actually going on, our doctors were just dismissed as LTT propagandists, or perhaps the LTT were intimidating them, so they had no option but to say that the casualty numbers were higher than they were. But either way, essentially the truth was then besmirched with terrorism. And the other thing that Jan wants me to touch on as well is the media aspect. So, in addition to the fact that the government was saying that the Tamil people were all terrorists and we can't believe what they were saying, this entrenched ideology of the war on terror being the problem in Sri Lanka means that even the mainstream press, and I don't mean the mainstream press in Sri Lanka, I very much mean globally, so even the press here in the UK or in the US, began to see the Tamil nation as terrorists. And even when we were saying, so for example, when our news outlets were saying that this is happening, casualty numbers are really high, there's high numbers of IDP, the government is bombing hospitals and schools, this was all ignored. It's only 3 years on that Channel 4 has now taken it up, that people started to come around and it's being believed. The UN panel report that came out after 2009 was, by that point, too late. I mean, we were saying this when it was happening on the ground in the months leading up to May 2009, and it was very conveniently ignored. But having put that framework into the discussion, I think now, 3 years on, we have to acknowledge that things have shifted quite a bit. I'm going to focus, in terms of the balance between repression and the Tamil resistance against this repression, to 4 key areas. So one is the fact that we now stand with the military defeat of the LTTE. Of course, this hasn't stopped Sri Lanka from using its emergency laws. It's very much, the emergency laws, I think now, the fact that they're still in place now proves the point of who were the government trying to terrorise. They say it was the LTTE, but actually, in fact, it's now being used against civilians, as it always was. The fact that the massacre took place, and that it is being recognised now, has definitely shifted that balance between repression and resistance, and it's about getting the idea of the two parties involved and the allegations on either side. I think now there's definitely being a more honest discussion as to where blame lies and the need for an actual investigation to find out exactly what happened. And the third point I was going to say is that although the government has now claimed peace, the fact that the violations are ongoing, I would argue the genocide is ongoing, is another thing that shifts the balance slightly in our favour, I guess. And lastly, as I think our first speaker touched on, the war on terror framework has shifted slightly. The Arab Springs have no doubt legitimised resistance, and particularly legitimised armed resistance in a way that was not happening in 2009 and in the 10 years prior to that. In terms of strategies of resistance, I was going to focus on 5 areas. So legal, political, media, and educational and social. Now, I know I've only got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to touch on things very briefly, and if anyone has any questions, then please feel free to ask about specifics afterwards. In terms of political, before I talk about that, I'm just going to say that obviously once the LTT was prescribed, the only way to de-prescribe that is legal. But I think politics affects the way the law is enforced. So the terrorism laws have been there for over a decade, yet it was only very much later on that they were enforced in a way, particularly in the Tamil struggle, in a way that really affected our work, our ability to advocate the rights of the Tamil people, both here and in the US and globally. I did have some quotes from the way politics has shifted. I'm just going to say one of them. So this is Hillary Clinton speaking in 2008. And bearing in mind sort of where we're coming from in 2008, she then says, "I believe that terrorism is a tool that has been utilised throughout history to achieve certain objectives. The bottom line is that you can't lump all terrorists together." Now, 2008 for us, by that point, for them to start shifting there and presenting a more nuanced argument to terrorism was too late for us, I'd argue. But I think it very much defines the idea of we need to engage with the wider politics that's going on. I don't think we can shy away from that. I think it fundamentally affects how the laws are enforced and it affects how we can operate. So I think since then, the Tamil community at large is very much engaged with politicians both here in the EU and around the world. For example, one of the things that we've done since 2009 is that the issue of whether we should de-prescribe the LTT has been coming up in Parliament again and again. And one of the other issues is that it's not just hardcore politics in Parliament, it's the idea of, by discussing it with MPs at a local level, we're legitimising our right to say that we think that the LTT should be de-prescribed, or just our right to advocate the rights of the nation, which so far have been suppressed. Moving on to sort of the legal aspect, as I said, we do need to challenge it legally. I think it's something that the Tamil community definitely will do, and the process of. But just to touch on very briefly one key success, in one of the Hague district courts last year, 5 Tamils who were actually charged with extorting money for terrorism eventually they were convicted of, I think the former one, it said non-violent threats to force Tamil exiles to donate money to the LTT. That was the conviction. However, in the process of that case, the court deemed that the LTT were not terrorists. It said that it was a non-international armed conflict, and therefore any atrocities committed by both sides should be reclassified as war crimes or crimes against humanity, not terror attacks. I think it's a small step, but it's a very, very significant step. The fact is that that ruling defies the EU's decision to put the LTT on the prescribed list in 2006. I have media as my next point, and in addition to what I said before, I was just going to say here in terms of resistance strategies, part of it is that we need to empower ourselves so that we have our own media. We can't necessarily rely on the mainstream press, which are too heavily influenced by foreign policy decisions and politics and sort of global order of things. By presenting our alternative media, I don't just mean newspapers or the internet, I also mean the social media. I mean, the impact of the social media is so obvious when we look at the Arab Springs. And one of the things is not just to do it in our language, so the Tamil media is fine, it educates our population, but we need to get the message out there in English and French to other people as well, so that everyone is clued up with what we're seeing on the ground. the last 2 points, in the interest of time, I'm just going to lump together and say education and social. And by that I mean is that educating and empowering ourselves. So in addition to media, we need to provide our own experts, our own specialists. So legal expertise, forensic expertise, I'm sure will come, and empower our community to be able to defend ourselves. So people are so scared when an organisation is deprescribed and a nation is criminalised, the whole nation then becomes scared. People hide back from joining organisations, and it's a catch-22 situation. So an organisation like the TYO, which has directly been affected by the terrorism laws, people are then scared to associate themselves with the TYO. I've had people come up to me and say, is it okay that you're with them because you're a doctor? It's an unacceptable situation, it's ridiculous. But we get in a situation where people are scared, so they don't put their name out, and then the organisation looks more sinister, and it's just this relentless cycle that somewhere we need to break. We need to empower ourselves, know our rights, and then go forward. On that note, I'm going to call it a day, but if you have any questions, there's so much more that I wanted to say, so let me know. Thank you.